Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of that Esports Podcast. Just myself and Josh again today, kind of as a bit of a follow-up from the last one. So for those who watched not last week, a couple of weeks ago, for those who watched the last episode or listened to it, we had Enatron, who's currently the head coach of Dignitas over in the LCS in North America. And basically, he had a bit of a technical issue. I think it was like he had to go into a different room where basically players were in and out of the background, which is why you could probably see and hear them at some points last week. So basically, we had to cut a little bit short. But what that's meant is we've got a load of questions left, specifically coach related, that I still want the answers to. And thankfully, Josh is an ex-coach. So yeah, you're in the hot seat once again, Josh. Hope you're ready.
Always ready, and the joys of Elias, obviously having to get ready for team practice and scrim time, and players coming in and out, and players certainly aren't bothered about him being on some kind of podcast or anything, and
Exactly.
wanted to make their own noise. But yeah, love it.
Thank
And
God. Thank God they didn't actually head to the ping pong table
Yeah.
first thing in the morning. That would have been worse.
Yeah, no, agreed. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of go through some of these that I had there. Maybe we'll veer off elsewhere as well. We'll see how it goes. So one that I feel like was maybe an obvious question that we didn't cover is how would someone actually start? Like, imagine someone's listening now who isn't involved in the scene yet, hasn't really been involved in a team. They think that they could be a coach. They'd like to give it a try. How would you actually get into that?
Yeah, I mean, that's there is no, as with lots of roles in esports, I guess, that there's no kind of this is the way you do it. There's no streamlined kind of university degree or college course or direct education link into esports coaching. I think, I mean, the way I did it was that I had a passion for helping other people around me, making other people better. I'd done it in traditional sports, in football before that, so I had some coaching background. I'd done a generic college course in sport and exercise science, so I had a kind of general person development background, whether that was kind of nutrition, physical education, physical kind of growth, whether that be a kind of some modules in sports psychology and such. So there was I guess, a holistic background from my side. I was doing then I went on to do a teaching degree, and kind of merged all these things into my passion and love for League of Legends and gaming in general, and realized I actually above just playing the game casually for fun, I really enjoyed the working with teams of 5 and helping them get better. This was way back in the days where ERLs weren't a thing, really. There was local tournaments, there was UK-based tournaments. So back then I did a little bit of that, which then kind of, as the years progressed and the scene kind of started to establish itself. It was the ESL UK Premiership back then that gave me my real ins to, I guess, semi-pro coaching or amateur level League of Legends coaching with players, and myself were definitely not paid in any way. I mean, I guess even back in the early days of Excel, which is now a multi-million-pound organization, we were in a situation where they were, when I first started working with Excel, they could just about fund tickets to go to Insomnia, if that. And so we're talking like 100 quid a person, and there was 5 players and myself, so 6 of us. So 600 quid was a real stretch back then for Excel when Kieran and Joel were at university and stuff. So that really shows you the blow up or the glow up of certain esports organizations from when I first started to now. But yeah, I think if I had to advise someone new going into the coaching route, and how do you really get into that, I think I would look at kind of Div 2, Div 1 assistant positions where you're not going to get paid, most likely. Especially just starting out, you're going to be almost an apprentice, an on-site learning apprentice, where you're either shadowing a coach, in which, I mean, maybe you share philosophy with, maybe you've spoken to about the game, maybe you've that they've put to you a project in which they just need more hands on the ground, really, and you start to learn off someone else. The other route is you go in at a lower entry level, but you take perhaps previous coaching experience from a traditional sports role, or coaching or teaching experience from kind of real life endeavors into a low level project, and start to try things out with teams, start to try things out with players, start to try things out as a collective, learn all the fundamentals of coaching through doing, really. And I think each of those would depend on each person's situation. Maybe you're someone who knows other people that are in the space,
Hmm.
people that are in the scene, people that have been around, and you do a lot of your learning off them. Maybe you don't have any ins at all and you don't know anyone. Then it's a case of looking up um, the European regional leagues through just Leaguepedia, or anything of that nature, and reaching out to people listed as managers or org owners, and seeing if they've got any positions where you can go and learn at an organization, whether that be from what they're currently doing. And I mean, from that point, it's make your own journey, carve your own path out, I suppose. And but as with all things esports, um, you have to be in a position really where you're not expecting to earn money from that position for quite a while. You're not expecting to really gain anything apart from the experience and knowledge of being in that position, which ultimately is the biggest things, the most important things that do take you to those paid roles in the end, should you succeed. But um, yeah, I think there's no set path for that entrance. It's really a case of honing a way in which you're going to add value to organizations and teams in the future.
Hmm. Cool. I noticed there that that answer is quite, I guess, is more geared around someone who's not played the game at any particularly high level, that's
Mm.
kind of not in the scene already, and that's something kind of a topic that we could go a few different ways on, I guess, about sort of ex players versus someone that is just a coach, because you've got, I don't know if it's, you can't really say, I guess, that one is better than the other, but perhaps like we get someone like Young Buck, who is one of the most successful coaches in Europe. He was a
Yep.
player, but then in the grand scheme of things, wasn't exactly. Well, he played in the LCS, which was the tier one in Europe, but he was never exactly pushing
He
for
wasn't a
you know
superstar or anything of that nature within his
yeah.
role, or within the region. Yeah, absolutely. Uh, um, I think the coach, traditional kind of coach with no playing background versus um, player transition to coach, is a very interesting one. I don't think they can be. I mean, you can make kind of generalized views over the differences, but I think that there's a vast difference between certain former players that are now coaches to other certain players that are now coaches, or tried to be coaches. And I think that there's varying success on that spectrum, quite drastically, about the differences of how that kind of works out. I think if a former player assumes in this day and age that they can move from playing to coaching with no desire or um I mean, what I guess what I'm saying, if a player wants to move into coaching just because they're not a good enough player anymore, and there's just like, I just want to take what I thought I knew about playing the game into a coaching role and tell players below me now at this point to how to play. Um, I think that's not a recipe for success. In honesty, I think if you are a knowledgeable player who wants to learn the fundamentals of coaching, or has done some kind of coaching, has some coaching knowledge, or wants to develop that, they're moving into a kind of strategic role, a team where you are obviously imparting what's already there, a specialized knowledge base about the game, or a
Hmm.
positional coaching role, where you're imparting that knowledge that you know, as well as still being really passionate about that role. And I mean, League of Legends is one of those games that's ever changing, as we know. There's patches every fortnight, so you can't just kind of rely on past knowledge. That there is some kind of core fundamentals around the way the game is played that would require drastic changes from Riot to be outdated knowledge. Um, but there's a level of kind of imparting knowledge that a former player, now coach, once had, while maintaining and updating that knowledge consistently as patches go by, as game variations or ways the game can be played go by, But then there's a huge amount more to coaching, which is where you articulate those points, the way you
Mm-hmm.
deal with certain other players around you, the way you incorporate that into practice, the way you set up or work with other coaches around you to set up kind of training and practice. And really, then there's various things like goal setting. There's certain things that you don't have to do as a player that really are required to get your point across
Yeah.
as a good coach, which I think both coaches that have never had playing experience before or coaches that have had high level playing experience before can pass on quite successfully should they put in the grind to be passionate about those coaching roles and learn those fundamentals of being a good coach.
Mm-hmm. What do you think then is like the perfect blend? Like, let's say you've got to build your ideal coach, and you can take a percentage of game knowledge and a percentage of just actual pure coaching skills. What would you think would be the best kind of the best ratio?
Sure. I mean, this I think varies a lot for um. So when we had Elias on from Dignitas, he was talking about the different roles in coaching. We spoke quite at length about the head coach role versus the strategic coach role, which was formerly kind of known as assistant, perhaps, and then even positional coach roles. I think someone like a positional coach, while there has to be an element of how they share that knowledge with a player that they're working with, it can be heavily weighted towards how much do you know about
Mm-hmm.
that position, that um that's your speciality. Your bread and butter is knowing that role inside out, and therefore when a player doesn't know questions answers about situations they encounter within games, there's a positional coach there to really have that knowledge base, to share that knowledge, who's also studied hundreds of games or thousands of games in that role in different regions, in different teams, how they come about those situations. So specialist knowledge from a playing side in a positional coach role is probably something like 80-20 or something. The player knowledge is super important. A strategic coach, I mean, again, super important that they are very in tune with um, current gameplay trends, basically how the game can be played. Also a view on how to better those current trends, how answers to certain things that teams are doing. Um, so, but equally, when you're holding um, team sessions as a strategic coach, where you're trying to develop that team, you can't. It's not enough at that point when you're to just know something and explain it how you would understand it, because there's five faces in front of you, and maybe 10 if you're talking to an academy team as well,
Mm-hmm.
in which interpret, take in, understand information differently. And I think it's really important at that point that that strategic role is someone who understands how to give information in a multitude of ways so that different players understand it. So it's probably still weighted on the kind of game knowledge side as a strategic coach, but I think it's probably more like 60-40 to be super successful if I'm
Mm-hmm.
building a dream strategic coach. Um, of that 60, that level of knowledge needs to be super high level, right? I mean, you can have 60% game knowledge and it be uh,
Wrong.
fairly low level, but or wrong, yeah. Which I mean, sometimes you can get outdated with ideas. I'm sure if I went back into coaching now, after a couple of years off, there would be fundamentals that are still clearly glaring and obvious about the game, but there would be certain ways I used to teach certain elements of macro or certain elements of micro, which actually they were kind of outdated now, and I would need to relearn updated ways of doing that. Um, and then I think as a head coach, this can vary massively. I think there are some head coaches that are top tier strategic coaches where
Mm-hmm.
they are taking on that role. I think there are some successful head coaches that game knowledge is a 20-30% part of their kind of repertoire, and the other 70-80 is real top tier good coaching from a team structure point of view, from setting a world class performance environment to discipline and behavior, and understanding how what isn't acceptable. Again, back to the kind of culture of the team, understanding practice structure, understanding kind of sport psychology, and ensuring that the players are in the right frame of mind, because League of Legends is a huge mental game where concentration plays a huge part into team success, and isn't the focus, the burnout, so I think head coach is the one that can probably vary the most. I mean, I think there's probably world class head coaches that have got 80% strategic knowledge and only really 20% background. But personally, if I was going to build that, I if you've got a good coaching structural team below you, where you have strategic coaches, where you have positional coaches, so this is really, we're now talking at a tier 1 level, because not many teams below that have much of that, then I think you can have a head coach with a lesser game knowledge, maybe a 30-40% knowledge, where you can lean on, you can delegate some of those strategic tasks to positional coaches, to strategic coaches.
Now that kind of that's not strategic side, like kind of like the mental side of it, and communication, things like that. I seen actually Kevin Hitt, who he's an esports journalist. I think he's esports journalist of the year at the esports awards last year, or maybe the year before, I can't remember exactly. He's been going off on Twitter recently about how, in his opinion, in general, the level of esports coaches is rubbish, and that most of them, don't know any stuff outside of the game itself. And he thinks that, in general, across esports, all sorts of titles, that should improve. And he actually said that it would be a good idea, in his opinion, to have some sort of qualification for coaches where it goes into that sort of stuff, and it may not be game specific, but talks about just how to communicate, how the fundamentals of being a coach in any kind of sport. I guess though it's a tricky one, because that kind of treads then into esports qualifications, which is a bit of a touchy subject. I know last time there was anything like that, it was a guy, Seb Park, I think his name is. He used to run Clutch Gaming back when that existed. A couple of years ago, him and with partnership with another guy, started like an esports qualification, which was just a broad thing, like, you want to work in esports, here's a qualification, you can pay to take this test, and we'll say yes, esports. And there was a big uproar about it, because people didn't feel like esports needed gatekeeping. It's always been kind of grassroots, and a lot of people get their roles endemically in esports. So it's a bit of an odd tricky subject. But would you think generally something like that could be useful, even if it is just for coaches? Or is it, I guess, could even be useful for a coach if there's not something like that? Maybe they should just, if they're interested in another sport that has them, maybe if they're a football fan, would it be worth them doing a couple of footballing badges to at least say, I've studied how to coach fundamentally in other things, something like that?
I think coaching courses in general exist, right, outside of esports. I mean, and there are shared fundamentals between coaching anything. The ability to teach even is a transferable skill to coaching. I did a teaching degree at university, like I said before, but there was a lot of things within that degree that I found very useful when transferring my knowledge to League of Legends and coaching. The way to talk to people, the way to motivate people, the way to get multiple people singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak, within a team environment. So these things are transferable. They can be learnt in a multitude of different ways, whether that be coaching courses, whether that be teaching courses, whether that be through experience. I don't personally think that it should be a requirement that to be a coach of a team that you have passed X and Y course. Although that is the case pretty much in traditional sports at a tier 1 level. If you're in football, for instance, you have to go through your UEFA badges to coach teams. There is one example at the moment going on in France where a young English coach, effectively his team has to pay a fine each game.
It's a lot, so like 20,000 euros or something per game.
About 20 grand a game, that they're basically fielding a coach that doesn't have the UEFA badges. He's on a huge win streak, and as a result, they don't care that they've got to pay that fine, because they're winning anyway.
And he's like the football manager dream. He's like younger than half the players. He's literally just come up as a different coaching roles and that. But
exactly. So that for me is fine if that happens in esports, that a coach doesn't have a particular set qualification. But I do, however, on the contrary, think that if you are committing to a career of coaching or a career of anything where you're developing other people, you commit to being what I'd call a lifelong learner, which is that you can never learn too much. You can never stop learning. Be like, I'm the best coach I can be now. I'm the best teacher I can be now." So, if there are um, courses available in which coaches at any level can develop their knowledge, can develop their, then I think it would be silly for coaches that perhaps don't have some of that knowledge to not take those courses. Um, I've always been a believer in furthering my knowledge, and you can never know enough within those situations. There's always something more to experience. There's always something more. There's always new approaches being kind of um, harbored in a way in which is a different approach to perhaps the way you tried.
Mhm.
And I also think there's a huge amount to learn from studying techniques that to either further cement your ideas about actually I think the way I do it is better, but to know the way the way you do it is better, you have to know the contrary, right? You have to know the antithesis to that idea about actually there's a different approach. Knowing the opposite approach doesn't necessarily mean it isn't a bad thing. It allows you to uh, further cement why you believe your idea is the better one to kind of the better approach to a team, because without knowing that approach it becomes really really difficult to justify yours. So um I think learning is a great thing. I think the ability to have access to learning, whether that be through courses, through whatever mode or medium, is extremely useful. And I don't think I think there's some people within the space that are probably just lazy, to be honest, and want to feel like they need to do a course to better where they're at because they're already at a tier one job or whatever it may be. But yeah, for me, I think it's something to be welcomed should it be done correctly. If it's
Mhm.
just a very generic uh, course that you can already achieve or attain at a generalized university or college, then or it goes off on tangents away from that the specialized kind of area we're looking at, then probably not great. But if it further coaches horizons about the way they can teach, the way they can approach their teaching, then yeah, I'm all for it.
Very nice. Um, I think the rest of the questions I've got are more. They're more going to be. Each one's kind of more separate, I guess. So we've kind of covered a big
Okay.
topic through a few different ways there. I think the rest are easier, just a bit more solo. Um, one of one I had them. So when you were a coach, you were one of these. Then obviously didn't come up as a player. You went in as a coach. So
Yep.
you're in the position then where every player you're coaching is better than you've ever been. I guess for the most part, I'm presuming. So it's not like some
Yeah.
coaches where they
Absolutely.
might have been a pro before, so they can kind of they're in a position where they might have the respect already of the player, and it's easy for them to tell the player, I think you should be doing X, Y, Z. I know I was good, But when you're someone that wasn't a player before, how do you give, how do you tell someone what to do? How do you give them advice when you know that they're a better player than you are?
Yeah, sure. Um, I think buy-in is one of the most uh, important things that I found within League of Legends coaching, and it's really hard to obtain, partly because every team historically started from the same place. We scrim X amount of times a week versus other teams. They see how other teams practice. We copy, duplicate, replicate what's going on in other teams. And if you don't do it like that, you're wrong because other teams are
Mm-hmm.
winning more. Um, and buy-in to change that in any way has been super tough, I think, for lots of different coaches over the times. But really, it's respect and trust. It's trust and respect that you're creating this environment in which um, ultimately everybody's rowing towards the same goal, and they're fine with things going up and down in the middle if that goal matches the ambition of the player, right? If the player's ambition is I want to be a playoffs team, we're a 10th place team, and the coach's ambition is initially that, but beyond that, then and you can display that to players, and you can display that some of the stuff that you're talking about is starting to work over a period of time. You give them, you make with kind of goal setting and stuff, you can do things like smart goals, a very kind of cheesy anagram, but
Hmm.
where you're making the goals kind of specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time given, and you can start to tick off these goals. There's a sense of achievement in which actually this person's making me better than I was before, and it's not. Does my coach have more knowledge than me? Does my coach know more? But if I go and ask my coach, um, what the Q ratios, what the AD ratio on Ezreal's Q is, or something of this nature. Does he know more than me? And I'll openly say no to my players. I think when if I started to kind of BS my way through in-game related micro questions, then some of that trust might be diminished. But I'll openly say, and at an LEC level, I've openly said, like, sure, your responsibility as a player, with the amount of games you play, with the amount of years you've put into the game, is to be a master of your own kind of role, right? You're a master with you're master of understanding these meta champs and why they're good. That comparison to other champions, you're master of finding nuanced counters to certain areas, or you're master of your lane. Of course, we can support and help with that, mainly through the utilization of perhaps strategic or positional coaching. But where I'm going to make you better is not necessarily, I'm not going to be able to make you hit more skill shots. I'm not going to be able to um, make you land your combos better. But what I am going to make you do is the where, when, why, and how
Hmm.
of as a collective, right? And once they understand that I'm not going to come in and tell them that, okay, well, look, I'm a gold player or a platinum player or whatever, uh, I'm going to be better than you at the game, because clearly I'm not. Um, Once they start to see within a practice environment the benefits of what I was doing, which was more around the development of a team as opposed to the development of an individual inside a game, um, then I think you start to kind of harbor that buy-in. Same with, I mean, we tried a significant amount of different things that probably had noses turned up at the time, um, whether that be certain practice drills we tried, whether that be, and some for sure didn't work and lost some buy-in on. I remember doing a drill once where players played a scrim against our academy team at Excel, and nobody was allowed to talk. Right, we had to communicate through pings, and yeah, no, it went pretty horribly for the LEC team actually, and the academy team really destroyed the LEC team. Um, but the purpose was not about the winning the game, the losing the game. The purpose was really to we were having not just the so we had a Korean in the top lane expect at the time, but we also had players who really struggled when on certain mechanical champions to hear comms, even when comms were
Hmm.
uh, verbally clear. So adding a visual into the communication. So we separated the visual, separated the verbal by removing the comms, added in pings and like timers and such to communication, and then put them back together as a collective. So there's a verbal and a visual communication to the play, and in the context of that practice session, the team hated it, right? Because they felt like they were a massive disadvantage. They couldn't speak. This is something they've always done. They always speak to each other when they're duo queuing with their mates or whatever. And I was putting them at a disadvantage. And initially, the buy-in was lost. I suppose that they didn't. That they thought it was useless practice. It's a waste of our time, so on and so forth. I think as time grew, they started to see some results when the things were put back together, that actually a verbal and a visual aid to their communication was useful. And you get some of that buy-in back, but it ebbs and flows buy-in, I think, dramatically.
Hmm.
But ultimately, end goal is to try and gain it. But going back to the kind of the main original point, I think you have to show, no matter whether you know more about the game than a player, whether you have a more kind of well-rounded, versed coaching background than a player, you have to provide value to a team in order to gain any buy-in. Once you provide that value, sure you're useful to the growth of the others. So whether that's through in-game or kind of outside of game development.
Cool. One thing then, it's actually a fairly easy segue after you said about the XL team, where you had the scrims against the academy and whatnot. So I remember that team, you guys were trying like a 10-man roster thing where it was sort of supposed to be where there wasn't a certain set of 5 starters. It was basically 2 for each position. Whoever's playing best that week could go
Yes.
up and down, which is something that was, I guess it's kind of not as much these days, I don't think, but it used to be fairly common in Korea, especially where a lot of teams would have really good backup players, and they would fairly often swap players in and out if they wanted to do different strats or even hide strats and things. I remember I don't remember exactly what year it was. It was one of the years that I'm pretty sure SKT won Worlds, and Faker probably only played half the games, even some of the playoff matches, because they had Easy Hoon, who was a decent sub, would come in maybe for some of the games they thought were winnable, and they didn't need Faker to show anything that they could hold for later on, stuff like that. The point is, though, in Europe at least, back then, still now, it's really not that common to do frequent substitutions like that. It's more if you substitute someone, it's because they are
benched.
They're benched, as in I don't want to use this player anymore.
Or... Sure. Yeah, I mean, sorry, go on.
Well, the question was kind of going to be, how do you approach that? So perhaps in each scenario, so when you were swapping in and out, because I imagine the players maybe weren't too keen on being subbed out and thinking they might not get back in, but then how is it also when you're benching a player kind of for good as well?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think back then I had a vision about how to do this, and that I probably still believe that actually it's in a dream world, in a everything works out world, it's the best route, as it is with traditional sports, to have a squad of players. And it's not a squad just purely because of physical fatigue or injury. It's a squad because there's tactical alternatives. There is motivational benefits to having multiple players. If I've seen some brilliant players really go off the boil and were unbenchable, really, because there wasn't anyone else to bring in of anywhere near the quality, especially players that have been there for years at that top level. The motivation starts to wane, and they need that kind of boot up the backside from someone young and hungry who's maybe not on that level yet. But my view is that the young and hungry one would be learning from a more experienced talent with a new infused level of energy and sense that they could actually get an opportunity playing at the tier 1 level through the system, should they be performing better than the experienced player, despite the experienced players perhaps wage, stardom, fandom, fan base, any of that stuff. Actually, if I had a young 17, 18-year-old that was performing better than my 25-year-old player who'd been at the top for 4 or 5 years, I was going to bring them in, and I made these changes at the time with those intentions. So Special joined into the LEC team at the time when he'd never been there before, replacing Exile, who former Unicorns of Love mid laner. I brought Mystiques in instead of Kasing. But the issues that present themselves that I guess aren't obvious to those who aren't part of that space are a few things. One, XL at the time was the lowest budget LEC team in the league, and the golf. I mean, what some of the LEC players were earning in 1 month was matching that of some of the academy players in a whole year. So to move someone in a contractual standpoint who's on maybe 200 grand a year to play in the NLC in the UK league, when a 25 grand a year player is playing in your LEC team, from an org standpoint, they're not too happy about paying 200 grand for someone to play in the academy team, so they don't want that to last ever. Two, we had, as we were the last LEC team to join the LEC in its inception year in 2019, we had troubles with facilities, I guess, or a bit of slowness on the facilities, where the facility in Berlin was only able to actually really accommodate 5 players. I didn't know this at the time I'm making the roster, but because we didn't actually have the facility when I started to
Wasn't
make the
the
roster.
idea? Yeah, wasn't the idea to be based in London at first and then
The,
fly
the
out
idea
between?
was the idea was to be based Monday to Thursday in Twickenham with all 10 players. We had 2 scrim rooms set up. They would scrim in their own respective teams, and I would decide by Thursday which roster would play LEC at the weekend. The issue with that is that the NLC games being in the week, Riot put in rules such as if you play in the NLC that week, you can't then play in the LEC the following week. So I didn't have Monday to Thursday to make a decision about the roster because I can't remember the days, but perhaps it was Tuesday, Wednesday, in which the NLC was played back then, and whatever roster played then couldn't then that they were unable to play the following week in the LEC. So actually, my hands were a little bit tied. I had 2 scrim days to make that decision, and those 2 scrim days ultimately weren't enough. So it did become 2 5-man rosters. When it became 2 5-man rosters, we also had an issue of with Brexit being Brexit and such, the visa situation for our Korean top laner Daehan meant that he could get a visa for Germany, which he'd had previously when he was on G2, but he could not get one for the UK in time. So he couldn't actually even be based in the UK. He had to be based in our German residence. Because of that, leaving one player in Germany felt all week while the others flew back and forth felt really bad. The vote came, and the vote was that the LEC team, the proposed starting LEC team, would actually be out based in Berlin permanently. So there was a lot of kind of non-playing aspects to why it didn't work in the way it should, in the way I believe it should have. I still think I see now more so than ever as an agent, I see Korean teams and Korean projects, while they don't directly have a 10-man roster, so to speak, they've got 3 or 4 teams of developing talent in which every single year in LCK, there's names join teams that you've never heard of, right? That you've just never seen before. And they've been in LCK Challenger, they've been in LCK kind of up through the ranks. So I've got a really close connection with DRX. After last year, we did some really close work with them as an agent, and their third team is probably better than their second team at the moment, and therefore on the cusp of kind of their main team's not doing very well this year at all, and they're on the cusp of going into the LCK. So they've almost got 15 to 20 players that are like not far off an LCK standard, which is kind of 15 players that could all play at an LCS standard, definitely an LCS standard. And these are players that are nowhere near the peak of their powers in terms of their development, so that they've got time to go. So there's a huge plethora of talent among there, where these organizations with plenty of money are almost harvesting talent from a young age through their third, fourth, into their second, into their first teams over the years. So they've got a talent factory, each team over there, where they're doing this brilliantly. And those who don't move into their first team often get sold. Right? We had a move to Unicorns of Love for their current jungler. Peach is now playing in the Prime League. He's a Korean player from DRX second team for their academy, their LCK Challengers team. He wanted a move. DRX didn't directly want to promote him yet. This is at the time where they had Piosic and were ultimately went on to win Worlds, right? So there wasn't really a position for him in the starting team. We, working with him, representing him, and have moved him across to Europe so that he can start to learn the things in terms of moving to a European culture, working in an English-speaking team, so that there's room to potentially he impresses in the ERLs at their top right now, move into either an LCS, LEC or LCS position not too far from the future. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of reasons in my instance why the 10-man didn't work. I think it can work, providing the infrastructure and the situation is set correctly, and player expectations are also set correctly. So we had some real hardships when I did make substitutions that I was calling it, but people believed it was benchings. Something like Mystiques for Kasing, where it's not nice because a player has to ultimately go get on a flight on their own, fly all the way back to England from Germany, and join up with the team they don't want to join up with. Ultimately, it's great for the player moving from the academy because they're super excited to get that chance, especially when they've never had that chance before to play at an LEC level.
Mhm.
So there's varying different things there, but I think squad type League of Legends is something that can be impactful when implemented correctly, but difficult to do.
Mhm. Do you regret going for it so quickly? Like where you say that it, Excel did have lowest budget and they got the spot late. Do you ever think like, oh, maybe I should have just done a normal one for the first 6 months, first year, or something like that?
Probably. It was probably part of my demise, kind of channeling too many new ideas early on, especially early on in the sense of I'd never coached at a tier one level. So I needed a bit of time to find myself within that structure, within that system. And yeah, it didn't quite go right for me. That's I mean, I've always said internally to people that were there and part of it. That's probably one of my worst personal performing splits that I'd had as a coach for the 3 or 4 prior to that. I think prior to that, back when we were in Reading with the Omen by HP House with XL, the year before they got into the LEC, we were a different animal, and I think myself as a coach was I felt way more in control of all the situations around me, and it felt uh, much more at ease. But when everything happened with XL, it became so um, there were so many things that we were disadvantaged at compared to the pre-organized LEC projects that were formerly EULCS projects. They had their facilities, they had parts of rosters, they had the pulling power to bring in other players because like players knew what to expect from these organizations because they've been there and done it before. So they had head coaches that have been head coaches at tier one organizations for multiple years. So to then be in with the lowest budget to try and recruit players that wanted to join a project with very different ideas and a collective of different things made it quite difficult at the time. So yeah, I probably do regret that. However, I do think it would be difficult to say we're going to do the same things as everyone else, but we're lower budget, worse, and new, um, which in some ways we were at that time. To then say like we're going to do everything the same as these other guys, but with a lesser budget and worse and less experience, would also have been a really hard sell and also hard to change. Should I be like 6 months in, 12 months in, and go right now we're going to have a 10-man roster, or when we hadn't built for it previously? So my view is that I was hoping Excel would trust me enough long term that even if our performances were not great for the first 6, 12 months, it was actually going to be okay because there's a long term strategy and vision behind it. But yeah, things didn't pan out that way.
Never mind. Right, so that's benching out of the way. Another one I had then. How do you go about rating another coach? So I think we touched on it a little bit on with Venatron, in the fact that it's just generally really difficult to know how much of an impact a coach is having because obviously you're not there day to day. It's not like
Yep.
in to go to traditional sports. I know football is going to be our common link. It's not like in football
Sure.
you can obviously see like the manager or the coach picks a starting 11. They pick the formation. If a team comes out with a new formation they've never played because they want to counter a specific thing about the opponent, and it works. It's clear that the manager's had a big part in that,
Yep.
and everyone's going to think the manager did great. But then in league, it's a bit, or in just league in esports in general, I guess it's maybe not as obvious when something like
I
that
think
happens.
sometimes the only real times that you directly see as an outsider a coach's impact in League of Legends are two occasions. One, there's a team that is not expected to be very good, and the only thing you can really point to is not a star player, but actually this coach must be making these players better than what we've ever
Mm-hmm.
seen, the way we've ever seen them play before. The other situation where you can see as an outsider a real coaching impact is when a roster, the only change of a roster is the coach, right? Is that head coach position. That head coach comes in with new ideas and a roster performs when they were not performing before. Um, But even those are really hard to judge the qualities of a coach. Precisely, if you're then another team thinking, should I take this coach to my team? I think that's very difficult. I think something that I worked on the year before last was I was working with Crusher, who became Fnatic's head coach for this winter split. Um, I was working with him when he was back at UCAM, and he really impressed me from I guess the first situation that I spoke about, players that were they were probably rated just maybe they make playoffs if they're lucky in Spain in Superliga. They went on to win it all and really push Carmine Corp in the semi-finals of EU Masters. So they won one split, came second in the other, but went on to semi-final of EU Masters twice and really exceeded expectations. I then started working with Crusher on his next moves, and he went to Fnatic. We did a deal with Fnatic in which he would become the academy head coach for a year, sign a 3-year deal, and become the LEC head coach for the following 2 years. So what they did at Fnatic is they took a look at him in the academy for a year, with a bit of a break clause after year one, and then made the decision up over a year as to whether he would then become the LEC head coach. But the intentions were that they thought he was really good right from the off, and that after a year in the academy, they could see how he worked, start to kind of move him into their culture. He starts to create his own culture, maybe bring some players from the academy with him, like he did with Rux, I guess, as an example. Took him into Fnatic. Obviously, it hasn't worked out at Fnatic in winter. They've made their changes. I'm actually no longer working with Crusher, so it's all different now. But the initial deal, I think, actually was something that made a lot of sense from Fnatic's point of view to look at a coach for a year in a less pressured environment and slowly ease him into potentially being the head coach of their LEC squad. I think when you're recruiting a coach as an organization, really, really tough to know the impact on a roster that a coach had. Sometimes you get references from players, right? But players don't want their coach to leave, so they're not going to be too keen on giving him away. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult one to judge the quality of a coach. I think that the best judgment is to be able to sit down and talk with that coach for a couple hours and really dig into their philosophy, how they see the game, how they see team building, how they see creating an environment, how they see culture. Really understanding their philosophy through interview is about as good as it gets, without doing like what I said Fnatic did, where they actually employ the guy at a lesser level, see how that person works, and then make a decision. But I think more teams should be doing that. Personally, I think not only should be training up young players, but you should also be integrating upcoming intelligent coaches to potentially one day lead your main starting team.
Yep. It's funny you talk about the Fnatic one as well. So that was something I actually wanted to speak about. Is with this new, so we're in 2023, and the LEC, so the Tier 1 in Europe in League of Legends, has made this new format where there's basically 3 splits a year, and each split starts with a 3-week regular season, and after those 3 weeks, the bottom 2 teams get eliminated. And the first split that happened, those teams were Excel and Fnatic, and basically both those teams. Now it's probably made worse because both of those would not be expected to be in the bottom 2. So Fnatic, obviously everyone knows, is one of the the biggest organizations in the world, and then Excel, not so much, but specifically their roster they got for this year looked like their strongest they've ever had, and people were even thinking they could push for the title. So for those 2 teams to go out instantly was like a huge disaster for both of them, and basically both of them have kind of imploded a little bit. So Excel have changed, I think only one player actually, so they changed their support, but then they changed their coaching staff. Fnatic have changed 2 players and also changed their coaching staff. So you've got this scenario, not only where it's a bit of a weird one where they basically had 3 weeks of actual play and then both coaching staffs are out of a job, but then also the other side where you've got now a new coach coming into each one. You've basically got 3 weeks again. Maybe from that side, what would you do, or how do you even approach that? Like, especially when other teams have been going for a few months already and they're in their stride now, and you've come into a brand new team and you've got to improve on what they had before.
It's very, very tough. I think the format, if So of course it can be obvious internally that
Mhm.
coaching staff isn't working, right? From a management point of view. I also think there are a huge amount of knee-jerk decisions in which it is easiest to kick or get rid of X player, X coach as proof that you're making a change than we are changing our philosophy, we're changing our stance, we're going to bring in more discipline to this squad, we're going to whatever the processes may be into fixing whatever internal issues the team may have are an easier and more visible fix is X player or coach out, X player or coach in. Because Europe is not in sync now, because it's got a winter split and a spring split and a summer split with other regions. I know teams like Fnatic, like XL, were scrambling for who's actually available mid ERL split
Mhm.
as a talent that would be useful to bring in, and really it was kind of former LEC free agents as playing options, or buy out a player from an ERL, which is great for ERLs because that money trickling down to the ERLs is really good if it happens. If coaches had buyouts, I don't know the situation. Someone like Hidden, who was at Ruddy, but for an organization like Ruddy, that's their first split in an ERL. If his contract was one where there was a buyout involved, and XL wanted him, and Ruddy charged a buyout to XL, how amazing for Ruddy. 10 grand, 20 grand, 30 grand is amazing for
Mhm.
an organization of that caliber. So if they got anything, to be honest, I know Ruddy's in a position where they're now boot camping at XL facilities, part of the deal, most likely, as to kind of allowing that to happen. So I think where stuff trickles down from the top to the tier two, great for tier two for sure. But I do think there are knee-jerk decisions that are made by teams in order to visibly show that they are working to fix the issue, as opposed to whatever the actual best possible fix may be to a situation. Because 3 weeks is not a long enough. It's just not long enough to the results that are displayed in 3 weeks, whether you win all your games or you lose all your games, are not a good enough indicator as to whether a process is working or not if it's a long-term process.
Mhm.
Someone like Young Buck has a bit of a different route because obviously he'd been there for several years before that, so it's not like he had 3 weeks. He had X amount of years to display put his stamp on XL. Someone like Crusher, for instance, though, literally had 3 weeks at Fnatic as
Yeah.
head coach.
Yeah, because I think they were said to have been like one of the last teams to start scrimming as well. So it's not even like you might have had a couple of months
Yeah,
before the season.
yeah,
It's
that's it.
brutal.
Yeah, and you lose your job, and I mean, again, I was not privy to his contract. I don't know what his contract said, but I'm hoping that his current agent had some kind of compensation in there, some kind of he needed, because I mean, if there's not any of that and he had just a release clause where Fnatic could just release him for free, it's a top tier coach who's worked his way for years up through the ERL, spent a year in the academy to show how good he is, and now just without a job, without any
Mhm.
income. Like, I
And like you
mean,
say, I guess where it's out of sync with the other leagues as well. So it's not like anyone else
like,
is looking for a
yeah,
coach really right now
it's
either.
not like you can get a job unless he's switched immediately into one of the other LEC teams. But why would an LEC team say we want X failing coach that the other team has set as determined as a failing coach
Mm.
to join us? So sure, I mean, I hope his conditions are good from his contract at Fnatic LEC, but I think it's really really difficult to make those decisions based on 3 weeks worth of results, whether they be finishing top by that point or bottom. I think neither would really give me a clear indication of how well the coach's philosophy and processes are
Mhm.
working.
No, true. I think I've only got a couple more questions left. Right, what's something a coach does that's maybe part of their day to day that a fan might not realize? I guess maybe that
Um,
could be different for different tiers. Like maybe I don't know, especially back in the
sure.
day, like amateurs, your coach might also be your manager and whatever.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've done numerous. I mean, when XL came into the LEC, I became, well, everybody became all hands on deck. So I went to IKEA with all the staff. We're buying beds, we're buying desks, we're buying general furniture for rooms. I was then in the preseason. We're waiting for players to fly from wherever they lived. We're building beds, we're building furniture, we're building desks, we're carrying this stuff from IKEA into their rooms. I've been getting players out of bed before that have slept in. They were up streaming late at night, or it was an off day the previous day, and they shouldn't have, but they went out and maybe got drunk, whatever, and I'm responsible for their performance. So if they're not out of bed and they're not scrimming and that I can't get anything out of them, then sure, it falls on my head. So when you're living with players, there's for sure that teaching players how to cook. I've done some of this, teaching players how to use washing machines, dishwashers, all mundane mummy tasks that you become team mum a little bit. I mean, often that's the manager's role within a house, but back in our Reading house in the Omen house by HP with Excel in 2018, we lived all under one roof, and some of these guys were 17, 18, never lived away from home, hadn't had a university experience or anything like that to go by. So it became kind of their uni home, and as you know, with uni homes, or as lots of people that have been to university know with uni homes, um, it can be, yeah, I mean, it's like a uni home with a couple of more experienced people that have lived away from home for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and it, just teaching generic things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. I mean, even stuff like within the Reading home at the time, we had one Spanish player, one Danish player, a Dutch player, a Bulgarian, and a Spanish player. So like none of them even really understood like England, certain things like the supermarket, certain things like how things work compared to in their countries, and so learning day-to-day life, I think, is probably one of the things that you wouldn't necessarily think of a coach doing, but day-to-day life skills for a lot of young players who have never been in that environment is definitely a thing that coaches do.
Maybe one more question then before we wrap up. Would you recommend coaching? And maybe a two-part. What do you recommend? And then what made you decide that it wasn't for you anymore?
I would definitely recommend it for sure. I think the reward of growth of those around you, if that's something that you're driven by, seeing that growth of others around you, feeling that achievement when a team bonds and works together. I made some of my best friends in esports for sure around the kind of coaching times where you've you're almost like a parent and a brother and a coach to some of these kids that you work with, and that becomes an amazing bond as time goes on and they go to develop their careers, or you win things together, um, whatever it may be. There's lots of things that impact the strength of that connection that you have with those people. So coaching is for sure a very rewarding profession. Um, Esports in itself is very difficult in as much as, like I say, if we use the Crusher example, one day you can be in your dream job, tomorrow you can be unemployed. Right? I mean, that's all employment ever, but it's very cutthroat. And I think that probably segues a little bit into the second part of your question, which is what made me change is that I got older. I got into a position where perhaps immediate LEC return was not necessarily on the cards, and if you drop down to a tier 2 level of coaching, the pay, the kind of lifestyle was not quite the same, and as a result, I mean, I've got to a point where like I'm building my own house, which I mean, you can't really think about mortgages and houses and stuff very easily if you're living with teammates, living in a team environment, having to move location all the time. I mean, if you're within the LEC, you're constantly in Berlin, so it's kind of one standardized location ish, but that's often away from your home unless you're a German resident. So being from the UK, obviously going out to Germany, girlfriend, family back in England, so being separated, long-term relationship, all of this kind of stuff, as well as chasing contracts, year-on-year contracts. My contract's up in November. I don't know if they're going to get rid of me. I don't know if I'm going to be there. I don't know what the situation is. Really hard to plan for any kind of future in that environment. If there's longer term, 3-4 year contracts that are better secured by good agents or by good people that are looking after the players, then it's hard. Then that kind of income is more secure for your future, and you can start to think about the future more. But in a world where it isn't, like my contract wasn't at Excel in the LEC, you can end up very quickly not having a job and not knowing where the next job is coming from, and that becomes very, very difficult. So the agency career wasn't one that I necessarily searched for, but one that kind of chose me, in as much as it fitted and aligned with perhaps some of the struggles I had later on in my coaching career, that I could do this for the next 20 years and really plan moving forward. I can I know that I'm employed. It requires effectively a sacking to remove me from my post, not just a we terminate your contract type thing. I know I have month by month income. I'm also based where I want to be based, which is back at my home, so I can actually travel to where players are that I represent and work with, but also be based in a centralized location with my girlfriend, and we're building a house and getting a mortgage and stuff. So I can plan for the future effectively. And when you get to kind of towards your 30s and stuff, we get to that point. We're not kind of young, early 20s, late teens anymore, where the future really doesn't matter. And it's about all living in the here and now. There becomes a point where you have to start thinking about what's the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years old. So that really was the transition is for me. I would definitely coach again, though. Saying that, I think if a right opportunity presented itself and it was one that saw the benefits in what I do, and saw, I guess, my specific set of skills, and I could spend a bit of time rehoning them into the coaching world. If the coaching offer was right, I'd do it again. But I also really am passionate and enjoy doing something similar, where I'm working with players to help them progress in their careers and develop in their careers as now an agent. So yeah.
Very nice. Right, I think we'll wrap it there then. So thanks as always for listening. Yeah, and as always, you can follow and subscribe and all the channels, everything like that. I realise actually you can, and I feel silly for not knowing this, but we're on Spotify right now as well. And if you're listening on Spotify, you can rate on there as well. Apparently that helps a lot. So if people wouldn't mind dropping a rating, as long as it's a good one. Otherwise, don't bother.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Then yeah, that would be ideal. And yeah, I guess
we're on everything, right, Lee? We're on TikTok, we're on YouTube, we're on Spotify. Like, you've got us everywhere. So everywhere that you can follow. If you like just little shorts, I guess TikTok's probably the best. If you want to listen to the full podcast, then YouTube or Spotify is probably the better medium for you. But every follow or listen is really great for us.
Definitely. And yeah, I hope you keep listening, and we'll catch you next time.